So this is Philosophy Out West. We've been doing a discussion series for the last few years, having lectures. But this spring, Peter Lupu and I began having these sort of philosophy discussions. Peter is head of philosophy and religious studies at Glendale Community College, and I'm a professor here at ASU. So we started a discussion series, and part of the goal is simply to have an example of what a philosophical discussion looks like, because they happen so rarely. And what does it look like to have civil dialogue about philosophical topics? And that doesn't necessarily mean a kind of unending discussion. Sometimes I get that impression when people talk about philosophy, it means just kind of talking forever about unsolvable problems. I don't think that's what we want to be an example of, but that we can make progress as philosophers. We can clarify some of our basic disagreements, and by doing that, come to have agreements, can even change our minds on things. Someone once mentioned that they were describing a discussion series they had, and they said, and people even come to change their mind. And like that's a big accomplishment. That should be something that happens. People do change their mind. In contrast to simply having unending learning, but never coming to a knowledge of the truth. So we wanted to model philosophical dialogue and show that it does have a goal, has a purpose. And you can watch our discussion from last time on YouTube. I don't want to repeat that here, but just by way of reminder, kind of like this is episode 2. And you get a little 20-second. Last time, we talked about some questions about common ground. If we come at this from different angles, I mean, we have a common ground that we both teach philosophy, but besides that, we may not have much else. Do we have enough common ground to make any progress? So we talked about especially the idea of reason as a precondition for thought and discourse, and what reason is, what it means to say it's the laws of thought. And then we looked at how to apply those, transitioning from kind of an epistemological discussion about knowledge to metaphysics. Can we think about if there is being from non-being and agree there isn't being from non-being, and instead that something must be eternal? And so as we came to the end of that discussion, Peter suggested we should talk about whether or not what's eternal is personal or not. And we sort of ran out of time, so we said, yeah, that's what number 2 will be about. We'll start there. But part of this is open-ended, right? This is not scripted. I don't have a script of where we're going, and Peter doesn't, because partly it's a discussion. And we'll have a little bit of a discussion, and then we'll open it up if you have questions as well. When I initially picked this date, it was to pick a Friday towards the end of the semester. But someone pointed out to me that this is Good Friday. And I thought, well, that's a very good day to have this type of discussion, especially this discussion that we're having, right? On the flyer it says, can we know the nature of God? And especially, Peter wants to talk about if we can know if God is personal or not. And that's a specific thing that is talked about on Good Friday, isn't it? Is God concerned about good and evil and redemption? And does God do anything about those things? So it wasn't designed that way on purpose, but it turns out, made me wonder, is there any better way to spend Good Friday than thinking about the person of God and the goodness of God and the possibility of redemption? So it did turn out to be a kind of an interesting day to have this discussion. But that said, is what is eternal, and I'll use that term on purpose instead of God, because God could be a loaded term, has a lot of ambiguity. We have to kind of work our way up to God. Is what is eternal personal? Tell us your thoughts. Tell us why you raise that problem. Help us understand the problem.
So I have been for several years thinking about this question. It's kind of called the personal versus the transcendent conception of God or the eternal. And the question is whether either conception is satisfactory. I myself have a lot of issues with a personal God. So I thought that we can discuss this question and ask whether a personal God can be known. What does it mean to know? What would be a personal God? Yeah. What would be a transcendent God that is not personal? So this involves both questions about epistemology, how do we know, what do we know, what can we know, and also questions about metaphysics, about the nature of the eternal.
And I predicted, actually this was last fall at an event at Glendale, but then also in February when we talked, I predicted that you and I probably agree on most of this for a reason I quoted from Ludwig Feuerbach, who was a 19th century philosopher. He wrote a book, The Essence of Christianity, and he said, if you want to know a man's God, show me the man. Or if you show me a man's God, I'll show you him. To get to the point that most conceptions of God are simply projections of ourself at a grand level. Freud says something similar a little bit later, and he's consciously working from Feuerbach, and he would say that religion or belief in God is an infantile delusion, that as we grow up, we're in our crib, and a giant being hovers over us and takes care of our problems, makes us feel better. And as we grow up, we find out this is our parents, and we find out all the limitations our parents have. So then we begin to feel insecure in reality, and so we project a giant being into the sky who will hover over us and solve our problems for us. And Marx said something similar, that religion, belief in God, is the kind of opiate of the masses. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes you need an opiate to get through life. Maybe life is really terrible and you need opium to get through it. The point wasn't a value estimation necessarily, but to say what belief in God does for us. There isn't a God, or if there is, we can't know God, which amounts to the same thing. There isn't a God, but belief in God plays this role of getting us through life, making us feel better, especially when there's coupled with otherworldliness. So you believe in God and you're promised a really nice afterlife. And all of the difficult suffering in this life will be made better because of a nice afterlife. So the term for all of those is idolatry. That humans make God after their own image, which is, of course, a reversal from the way it was spoken in Genesis, which is that man is the image of God. But idolatry is making God into the image of man. And Ludwig Feuerbach and Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud point out this in modernity. And I think that one of the things you were getting at that made me think of those quotes was most of the time in religion is just the projection of our own desires, our own personality onto God.
What I call the avatar of ourselves.
Yeah.
Now, let me just say that I'm trying to be somewhat careful here because sort of like the distinction you made, the psychological and kind of more the cognitive aspect, we shouldn't be ignoring completely the psychological need. No. And I don't want to ignore it. But I would like to also warn against only sticking with the psychological aspect, the aspect of the need in cases of emergency, in cases of suffering, in cases, these kind of cases, and hopefully go beyond it to the cognitive level when the questions of truth and falsity arise, evidence, rationality, reason. But I don't want to also ignore this other side because then it would be, then religion will be just an abstract sort of, the game.
Yeah.
So there has to be a balance between the two. But we have to be careful because if we only focus on the psychological need, we are very quickly can sort of slide into idolatry.
Well, what happens too, I think, is that the psychological need, we're probably mostly aware of that. But we don't notice that the way we're interpreting our psychological need involves a lot of assumptions that we have. And those may or may not be true.
Right.
And so before we get to, am I correctly interpreting my need and how to fill it, we'd have to get back to those to say, am I even understanding my need correctly? I might be misinterpreting it. I might be making assumptions about what the world is like, which then shape the way I try to fill my need. So I think in philosophy, we'll especially want to press back to that cognitive level. But we could maybe mention that there are different ways of using the word know. And it comes into theology this way, that someone might mean by the word know something like acquaintance. And so when you talk about knowing God, what they might mean is something like, well, I'm acquainted with God, or I've experienced God in an immediate first-person way. And that we understand what people mean when they use the word know that way. they're talking then about a kind of experience they had, and then they draw certain conclusions. So they're doing both. They have the acquaintance, and then they have conclusions about, true or false conclusions about their experience. And a lot of analysis happens about, did you have that experience or not? Was it a hallucination, etc.? What I like to focus on is, are the conclusions you're drawing from it, do they follow? Mm-hmm. You might be able to draw multiple conclusions from the same experience. And what are the assumptions that led you into having and interpreting that experience that way? So, for example, when people have after-death experiences or near-death experiences, mm-hmm. they tend to have them with, I think almost universally, within their cultural religious understanding, right? Which indicates that these aren't sort of objective things, but they're bound by assumptions you brought into the experience.
Right.
So I like to look at both of those. I'm not discounting that there is knowledge by acquaintance, but I'm raising a question about how is that acquaintance shaped by our assumptions, mm-hmm. and then how do we interpret it? What true or false beliefs do we make claims about?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that when we make these distinctions, we also have to be aware that they are sometimes interconnected. They're not completely separate. So you're right. I think that when a person experiences a religious experience, then that experience itself may be framed in terms of various background assumptions they make, beliefs they have, and it requires quite a lot of reflection in order to uncover both and the influence between them. Yeah. There are a lot of questions about just the extent to which religious experience, is it a proof for the existence of a God, or is it merely evidence, or how does it exactly work? What kind of knowledge you can get from religious experience, like what you call acquaintance?
Yeah, that and, for example, if we use this word eternal, we talked about what is eternal last time, which means what had no beginning. And we talked about how something must be eternal because the alternative is to say being came from non-being. Mm-hmm. But then this raises the problem, which I think you might be wanting to get to, about personhood, which is how would you experience what is eternal? Okay, come on in.
Yeah,
how would you experience? What does that even mean? I mean, our experiences are of temporally existing objects. So what would that even mean to have an experience? And once we begin to frame the question in terms of what's eternal, it shapes differently because people's religious experiences tend to be of something more like Zeus, mm-hmm. right? Or some embodied being came to me and told me something. But how would you experience what's eternal? You'd have to, if you're going to know what's eternal, you'd have to use reason to know what's eternal. You couldn't know it by acquaintance. Like, I bumped into what's eternal. I went out to get a soda, and on my way I bumped into the eternal. He was getting a soda also.
You did. Yeah. You just didn't know that. Here is, however, I would like to make a distinction regarding our conception of eternal. It's kind of like framing it in the way we ended up last time, and you repeat it here, is like an eternal is something that doesn't have a beginning and presumably no end either. But we can think of what the concept of eternal either quantitatively or qualitatively. You can think of the eternal in terms of quantitatively. It's just like, for example, some sequence of let's say numbers. That is infinite. Yeah. Fractions, infinite in both directions. So you can think of it that way. And then you think of the eternal as, and then the question arises, when you want to assign certain characteristics to this eternal, which eventually you want to get to the concept of a God, because that's what we want to talk about. So you're going to have to assign characteristics. You're going to have to say how this quantitative conception of the eternal, for example, fits with omnipotence or omniscience or omnibenevolence, things like that. But you can also think of a conception of the eternal in terms of qualitatively. In other words, the eternal is not to be thought of in terms of never ending, never started, but rather in terms of certain qualities that are themselves sort of perfect. And then when you assign, for example, questions, the issues such as, for example, omnipotence, you're not saying what we mean by the eternal that is omnipotent is that, it's kind of a super duper Superman or something, a huge, somebody who can be stronger than anybody or whatever. A different conception is involved.
Yeah. Right, so that's part of what we have to do in philosophical discussions is clarify meanings of terms. And you probably wonder what philosophers do in their spare time. Do you ever wonder that? That's how you spend your time, is spare time, is wondering what philosophers do in their spare time? Well, I was reading something this morning which was about that, and I'm hesitant to bring in readings because it's never any good to read things to people in the audience. It's kind of boring. But this one stood out to me, and I also thought about it because it's from someone that I think we both respect, we probably both use in classes. And so this point actually came out, if you don't mind, Hume. This is how philosophers spend their free time, is by reading David Hume in his dialogues concerning natural religion.
Yep.
And he said this: all men of sound reason are disgusted with verbal disputes, which abound so much in philosophical and theological inquiries. And it is found that the only remedy for this abuse must arise from clear definitions, from the precision of these ideas which enter into any argument, and from the strict and uniform use of those terms which are employed. So this is the character Philo. Mm-hmm. But I only read that to you because that's not, the pursuit of being clear is not just in the domain of analytic philosophy. This is pre-analytic philosophy. Mm-hmm. And theology especially is known for not being clear about its definitions, right? So when we use the word eternal, you give them some alternative ways of meaning it. And usually I think when my students use it, they mean without an end.
An end, yeah.
My soul's eternal. So here we're using it specifically to refer to what had no beginning. And then when you say we could have a sequence of things, I refer to that, I use the term for that, unending. Mm-hmm. And I think it raises some problems if we say something could be eternal without a beginning and have gone through a sequence of events. That's essentially what the Kalam cosmological argument deals with. You can't, if you were eternal, you had no beginning, we already know you're not going through a sequence of events for the reasons in that kind of argument. You're outside of time. So to say that something's eternal and going through events is like saying something's eternal in time. And it raises all kinds of problems about infinity and crossing infinities, etc. So I would say we rule that one out already. We know something's eternal, it's not in time, it's not going through a sequence of events, and that time itself hasn't already gone through infinity plus more. So I would use unending for that. And infinite, I would use about, I think, what you meant by qualitative.
Yeah.
I would use the term infinite. So I'm not saying we have to use the terms the way I do myself, but just to say we could at least agree so we're careful and we don't our misunderstanding is not because of different uses of words.
Yeah.
But when we talk about, say, God's goodness, and I say, instead of saying qualitatively eternal, I just say, yeah, he's infinitely good. That than which nothing is greater.
Right. And it's fine with me as long as we understand each other. Yeah. The only reason I'm not using that kind of terminology is because when you say infinitely good, that connotes degrees of. I am kind of somewhat evil, and then you are better than me, and somebody's better, and then there is infinitely and sort of. So, whereas what I mean by qualitative, I genuinely mean like a quality.
Yeah.
But with very specific characteristics. But I'm willing to go along with that language. And we use infinite.
Well, you just raised this problem of infinite and having a little more, a little less is what the same character, Philo, says of why we can't say God is good. We usually slip into meaning by that something superlative, like really good. Mm-hmm. Infinite just means super, super good.
Right.
And it ends up being kind of an empty term. Mm-hmm. So because of that, he concludes we have to say of God, or the source of being, that God is not concerned about good or evil. And so that stood out to me. I really was reading this independent of this. Mm-hmm. He was preparing for class. But it stood out as I was reading this. I was thinking, well, this will be good. This will be helpful for Peter, because he says explicitly, the true conclusion is that the original source of all things is entirely indifferent to all these principles, good and evil, hot and cold, wet, and dry, all such things that concern us. The source of being the original source of all things has no more regard to good above ill than to hot above cold, or dry above wet, or light above heavy. And so for me, as I was thinking about this, that's what I was thinking was the problem of personhood. Is the source of being concerned at all about good and evil? And why I said Good Friday is a good day to talk about that, because many people take that to be an example of how God is concerned about good and evil and works for redemption. But that's what I was thinking about in terms of personhood, because once we say something is not concerned about good or evil or anything like that, this doesn't seem to be a person anymore. So what does it mean to recognize something as a person or not? And I think he's talking to the character Cleanthes, who is called an anthropomorphite,
Right.
which means he thinks God is essentially like us, just more powerful. Sort of like, pick your favorite superhero. Who is it? Superman? Batman?
Yeah, super duper.
Superman's too super. Batman's not enough.
No.
You need like Thor, somewhere pretty super, but not just a human.
And that's a problem for me.
Yeah.
And
that's what I thought. I'm trying to set it up here so you can.
Yeah. And my main problem is that, like, for example, if you start to ask yourself what really goes into the question, what goes into the idea of a person-like eternal being? Well, person-like has to mean something that has to do with what we mean when we call each other a person. And so a person is somebody who has certain attitudes, like, let's say, caring, needing things, maybe being affected by relationships and how they evolve, having characteristics like beliefs, desires, various different things like that, hopes, emotions, and all of this, what makes a person. But notice that all of these are changes. Or like, so, you have an emotion for a minute, and you can have it stronger or weaker, or it goes away, something else comes instead. You can reflect on your emotions and say, hey, that was inappropriate. I overreacted. Criticize your emotions. I don't know whether any of this makes sense regarding, eternal being.
And I would guess that's part of what happens then is this. If we're approaching the question, is anything eternal? And we conclude, yeah, we're required by reason to recognize something's eternal. We might concede that, but then also say, what's eternal is so far beyond us, so different than us. Because what's eternal is unchanging. If you've existed from eternity, you're not growing or decreasing anymore. You already are what you are. Especially, I mentioned earlier, outside of time. You're not going through an infinite series plus one. That only works when you're arguing with your kid brother, right? Oh yeah, well, infinite plus one. So this is infinite, eternal, unchanging. And so then we might say, I can't relate to such a being. I'll have to find lesser beings that are going through the same sorts of things I'm going through that I'll worship and interact with. And a lot of the world's religions do such a thing, right?
And this is the problem. That's why I mentioned earlier the psychological aspect and the cognitive aspect. If you go too far into the abstract concept, too transcendent concept of the eternal being, then you deprive any psychological connection. If you go too much into the psychological connection, then any cognitive reflection on that being becomes very difficult to reconcile and make sense of.
Well, but part of the problem I was getting at was, let's say, apart from the psychological connection, if you end up saying, I have to only relate to another being like me, just a little more super, you're still left with the problem of what's eternal. There is still this eternal being.
Yeah.
And it still raises that question, what is my relationship to the Creator then? This is the eternal being is the creator of all else. And so you're still left with that question of what's my relationship, and it becomes more like a preference to say, I'll only relate to other temporal beings and only pray to other temporal beings, as opposed to even if there are such things, you can hang a question mark by that, we've already shown there is something eternal. What should I know about that? What is my responsibility and my duty towards what's eternal and knowing what's eternal?
Right.
And it does raise an interesting problem this way. The presumption that if something's not in time, I can't relate to it. I'm not sure why that would be true. Or that if something's in time, it can't hate evil and love good. It seems like you could eternally hate evil and eternally love good. You don't have to go through human emotional swings. In fact, that's part of what we would want in an unchanging being who can make lasting promises, is that they're able to make these promises precisely because they're not going to change. They'll always hate evil. That won't change. They didn't get it wrong. Sometimes when we make promises, we get it wrong. Right? We might think something's good and it isn't, and we change our mind later, and that changes how we think about a promise we made. So when we're relating to this being, it would seem to me a lot of psychological assumptions go into what we want in the relationship, because for me what's important would precisely be the unchanging character of God, that God always loves what is good and can act based on that.
So here is, so let me give you an example of which might take us a little bit away from what you just said, but I will get back to it in a moment. I just want to give a concrete example of what can happen if we use concepts that we are familiar with in our interrelations with others, and then import that concept with that understanding to a God.
Yeah.
So many people are said to be devoted to God. Well, what does that mean, to be devoted to anyone, to any person? So, for example, we have examples of being devoted to family members, to children, to friends. And one of the sort of clearest understandings of being devoted to another person is caring about their condition, caring about whether they are vulnerable, whether they need something. I think that's what I think is part of what it means to be devoted. But notice that if we take that concept now and export it to relationship, to understanding what people mean when they say they are devoted to God, things break down very fast. Because that concept of devotion that we use in our interpersonal relationships presupposes that the subject of devotion is vulnerable, lacking. If we then say I'm devoted to God in the same sense, then you have to assume that God is vulnerable and lacking, which contradicts a general conception of God. So you have to now say, well, it's either a metaphor, and then you have to say what's the metaphor means.
Yeah, spell it out.
So this is what I say is a danger of taking concepts we use in interpersonal relationships and transporting them to a relationship, to eternal.
Well, that's the problem that Feuerbach was naming.
Yeah.
Because we each of us have different things we value, and so we each of us project different things onto God.
I have a question for you about what you said before, which takes us back to this.
Well, let me this idea about caring.
Yeah.
The problems you raise are right about it, and yet we would still probably want to say something like, I care about God, and what does that mean? And what comes to mind for me is especially the religion of the world and sacrifices. So, for example, the distinction stands out to me between what happens at the Jewish temple and what happened at Greek or Roman temples. In those mythologies, you have to give something to, say, Zeus or Sidon because they need. Mm-hmm. So you're offering them bulls or goats because they need some things. And that's very different than what was going on in the law of Moses, where the sacrifices were understood, not that God needs anything. He himself says, I have the cows in 1,000 hills are mine. I don't need these sacrifices, but they're indicative of the human condition before God of needing atonement. And so the very distinction there that comes out in looking at the two kinds of sacrifices gets to this precise problem. On the one hand, the Greek view that gods could need something, and all their gods did have a beginning, right? There's a very important stories about where they came from and who their father was and how they cast their own father into Tartarus. And on the other hand, when Moses says to God, the burning bush, who should I say sent me? God says, tell Pharaoh I am. Right? This is the eternal being. No beginning, didn't have a parent story who he threw into Tartarus. And so the sacrifices come out differently. So the Jewish teaching is not God needs something in the law of Moses, and so you throw him some sacrifices, but instead that it indicates something about what we need.
Right. So now, so that's one way of doing it. We need to be devoted to something, not that that particular object needs.
Yes, like my care about God isn't that, if I don't, I think there's a Star Trek where they come across the Greek being, the Greek gods who are aliens, and people stopped believing in them, so they depart for another planet, right? So there's stories like that where the gods get weaker if humans don't believe in them. And so that's one sense of care, like I care about the gods that way. Or it could be, I care about the same ends that God cares about.
Right. Okay,
and I care that God is known.
Good. So I just want to return to what you said before about, I agree that it's important to point out the assumption behind the idea that, for example, or ask the question, can a being that is eternal in this sense have characteristics that we, when ascribed to finite beings, human beings, they change? That was the example of love. So when we talk about human beings and attribute to them the characteristics of loving, that comes with change. That can change. It can be enhanced, it can weaken, it can, one day we don't even think about somebody we love, but the next day we suddenly think about them. So it can come and go. Maybe it is latently there in some sense all the time, but it can change. But the question is whether you can make sense of the idea that an eternal being in this sense loves, but it never changes. Because that's what you wanted to say.
Yeah, I think that's what the word holy means. Holy means perfectly loving what is good.
But maybe then what all you mean is that it's just love. It's not that there is an it that loves.
Yeah, I don't know about that, because it seems like that love itself is a relational term, right? So X loves Y. You couldn't abstract it out and just be like, there's just love. You'd say, what's loving what?
Why not?
Or if you did, then it would be, at least it'd be a different definition of the word that I'm using. So then we'd have to figure out what exactly is it. Like the Greeks might say love just means attraction, gravity itself. Mm-hmm. So atoms love each other by being attracted to each other. So but for me, that wouldn't make sense. I'm using it more the way maybe Aristotle uses it, that love is seeking the good for another. Mm-hmm. So it's simply different definitions of a similar term.
But here's my problem. If you commit yourself to a relational concept of love, then I think you're going to have to admit that can change.
Well, it depends what you mean by change. Like, someone could be doing something that is good at time T1. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, they might say they're loved. And then at time T2, they're not. And so now they're said not to be loved.
That could be one change. The other change, it could be that it weakens or strengthens. But as long as it's a relational, then I
would think that the weakness or the changing is coming on the part of the human, whereas we can say God, in this definition, perfectly always loves what is good. But I think part of what we might be dealing with is this problem of, is love necessarily in time? And what is God's relationship to time?
That's one aspect of the issue.
So it might say, I've indicated whatever is eternal is not in time. Part of the definition of what's eternal, it runs into these other logical problems. So then we could be positing, well, between us and the eternal, there's a whole bunch of levels. This is called Greek Gnosticism, where it even shows up in Marvel, where there's this highest being, the one above all, but so different than us, so abstract. We don't know anything about the one above all, and we just relate to the closer beings like Thor. And so this shows up in Greek Gnosticism, in popular culture, and it's the idea that I can only relate if God is in time. And I was raising a question earlier about that, if really we might want to flip that, and we relate even more personally to something that we know won't change on us, that dependency is incredibly important, both in terms of this one always will love what is good, always hates evil, doesn't change in the promises that are made, whereas humans do those things. Humans are the ones who break promises and make those changes. And I also wonder if part of the problem comes up that of the distinction between a temporal order and a logical order. So, for example, in asking how does God relate to time, someone could say, if God is eternal, God doesn't relate to time, and so God would part the Red Sea when Moses is a baby, which is completely unhelpful. Because God doesn't know when to part the Red Sea, God's not in time. And I think that's not recognizing that the temporal order is an expression of a logical order, which is eternal. Logical orders are eternal. They're not necessarily in time. And the logical order between baby, adult, part in the Red Sea is what is important, right? In the logical order, you part the Red Sea when Moses is there, with Pharaoh coming down after him, not when he's a baby in the boat of reeds. So I don't think if we distinguish between those two, I think it clarifies a lot of the problems between God and time and God dealing with logical sequence of things. And we don't have to say that if God's going to relate to us in time, God must also be in time.
So what you are saying here is that it's possible to conceive of a conception of, let's say, like love, God that is outside of time, has this attitude towards us that is never changing. And so it would be analogous to the concept of love that we have in our interrelationships, but it's sort of frozen.
It could go the other way. Instead of taking
like
our relationships as the standard and God's kind of like us, it could be the reality is God, and our relationships become loving insofar as they are like that.
Yeah. So you see,
and it might be this, because we haven't talked about this yet, the changeableness of the humans, because often it's presented like God's kind of waiting, wringing his hands, waiting to see what are they going to do, I don't know, and then God changes based on that. And so I think part of the temptation of the discussion about the personality of God is towards what is called open theism, where the relationship between us and God requires that God is just like us and he's learning with us and figuring things out, and he's watching us as we grow, and he's hoping for the best, but he doesn't know what's going to happen. And I think we rule that out already logically by saying something's eternal, and what is eternal is infinite. There could be other beings like that. I really like Milton's Paradise Lost, and he talks about a whole bunch of beings that are like that. They're greater than humans, but they're not God, and they're in conflict with each other, and there are good ones and not good ones. And many humans get involved in worshiping those. When the devil and his angels have fallen in Milton, and they're getting together to discuss what's next, the names of the demons are all the Canaanite deities. There's Chemosh and Belial, Baal, talking about what to do next. And one of the things they want to do is get humans to worship them. So there might be, put a question mark by that, but that still leaves the problem that something is eternal, and we have a relationship to what's eternal, whatever other kinds of things are that also exist.
So the question is, then you ask yourself, okay, let's for a moment grant, and just for a moment let's grant the idea that you could have an actual relational concept of God where one of the relata is outside of time and the other is in time, which I still have to ask some questions about that. And that relation is that particular relationship is one directional because it can change. And the other concept of love that we have is the other way, which can change.
Yeah, maybe that's one of the assumptions going into it is, and which leads to open theism, is that relationships require change. So maybe we want to raise a question about that and see maybe that's not true. At least this much, unless you want to say nothing's eternal. If something is eternal,
not all relationships require change.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So if something's eternal,
exactly,
then by definition we're related to somehow to what's eternal, and that what's eternal doesn't change. But we might be asking, is the object of religious devotion something that must be sort of like us?
And even if, let's suppose we grant, suppose it doesn't have to be. Let's entertain the case when it's not. What could it be? You know, that's so.
How about this? Because in talking about love, what we're really getting pressed on, as I'm using the word love to mean I love someone when I seek what is good for them. So if I love Peter, I seek what is good for Peter, even if Peter maybe doesn't want what is good, right? That's what it means to be unconditional love. And so before we can get to what love is, we have to get pressed back to what is it that's the highest good at all. And so loving God and loving the highest good are closely connected. They may not be the same thing, but they're closely connected. To love God is to love the highest good. And it's interesting, I notice sometimes that it seems like the second greatest commandment gets put in the wrong order. So people will talk quite a bit about what it means to love your neighbor and all the relations, human relationships that go into all the things that come up, economics, war, ethics, between humans and loving their neighbor. But of course, the first commandment that summarizes all the commandments is to love God. And those seem to be importantly different. So in loving other humans, there are the kind of changes you're bringing up. But what would it mean to love God? It seems like you'd have to know God. Loving God involves at least knowing who God is. That's the first step, at least.
Right, but if you say that in an interpersonal relationship, love means, desiring something good for the other person you love, that of course can't be again transported to what it means for us to love God.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. That's the second commandment with other humans.
Right. So you can't
what would it mean
take
to
the
love
model of what it is to love your neighbor and say that's what it means to love God.
It would go the other way. So instead of going from number 2 to number 1, like I'll love God the way I love my neighbor, we would say my love of my neighbor, the thing that's absolute, in this discussion, people will take the human relationship to be absolute. And I'll love God the way I love other humans. Right. And I'm flipping that around, and it's the order of the commandments, and saying the absolute thing is how I love God, and then I love my neighbor in a way analogous to that.
So what, in your view, is it means to love God if it's not to be analogous to loving your neighbor?
Well, it is analogous but not equated.
Right,
so
but what would it mean?
Well, that's why I said the first step would just be even knowing that there is a God, distinguishing God from not God. And I think that works out pretty well in human relationships, because if you are sending a human relationship a Valentine, and you send it to the wrong one, you're going to be in big trouble, right?
I think so,
yeah. Or you have a lineup of possible Valentines, and you're supposed to pick which one's your Valentine, and you pick the wrong one.
First clarify what means wrong one.
Yeah, right. Well,
could be the right one.
You got the cards mixed up. Oh wait, no, this one's for you. That one's for her. Sorry. At that point, you're in big trouble. So, how about that with God? The first step is, can I distinguish God from not God? God's not nothing, non-existence, and God's not the material universe. God's not my own soul. Those are just a couple steps, knowing what isn't God. And if I can't do that, I can't really say I love God. I don't even know who God is. How could you love what you don't even know who God is? You might be loving the wrong one. God's that guy with the toga, not the guy with 6 arms.
But the question that I have is, suppose you know what God is. And let's say you know your neighbor.
Yeah.
You still can't say that you know God. You believe that there is a God. You know that there is a God. Okay, what does it mean to love God that is the same and different than loving your neighbor?
Yeah, no, that's a big thing to say. Let's say you know God, because that's where like most of the work occurs, right? And so to love God seems to be to grow forever in knowing God. This is an unending thing. You can't run out. You can't say, okay, end of the book. Now I've finished knowing God. So the devotion you asked about earlier, the religious devotion or devotion to God, is not because if I don't pray to God, he gets weak and can't fight his enemies. But I can always come to know God more and apply that in my own life. That's unending. So it's the pursuit of God. And so the analogy, which is an analogy that's drawn in the book Song of Songs, the pursuit of the object of love with focused devotion, right? And so I pursue knowing God in all areas of life with that kind of focused devotion. Seems to be what we find in this scriptures as opposed to, say, a Greek or Roman model.
Right, but my concern is this. If we assume that we assume everything we already said about a God that is eternal in the sense we talked about, unchanging, not in time, what then is the concept of devotional loving this being that is in some way similar to what it means to love another person and devote it to another person, but in some sense is different?
Well, the similar part...
What's the different part?
And don't let me forget, this raises remind me to say, hey, don't forget the thing you didn't want to forget. But the similar part is that, especially I was giving the example of a Valentine earlier, Valentines want you to know them in great detail. And if you give a kind of generic card that says, hey, love you lots, they're not going to care too much, right? They want you to detail the shade of the color of their hair, their eyes, everything that you can about them in detail. That's what it means to love to be devoted to the object, and that's why I mentioned the Song of Songs. That's what the person devoted loves and names characteristics of. So do you love God? Can you name the characteristics of God? And here's what I didn't want to forget.
Yeah.
Some people take Dante, who loves Beatrice and wants to be devoted to her. And we see in Dante two kinds of examples of love come out. Because on the one hand, he observes her and he can tell you all about her. But on the other hand, he ends up wanting a kind of direct vision of her as the highest goal. And these are conflicting. Because the direct vision is not cognitive. We were talking earlier about cognitive true or false. It's a kind of experience, and so you don't even know if you're having it, because once you say I'm having it, you're into truth claims about it. But the first thing I was mentioning was observing her and knowing her, seeing what she does, and seeing why she's great, being able to explain why she's wonderful. And so that, in Dante, is meant to be an analogy to perfect love, and we can take that out and say, there are those who say what it means to know God is to have something called the beatific vision, which is, I think, what Karl Marx was objecting to, in the sense that after death, you'll get this perfect vision of God, so don't worry about changing this world. All that matters is after death. And it's a kind of immediate perception of God. That's how I'm defining it. Because like all the terms we're using, beatific vision could be used in lots of ways. So the beatific vision means a direct viewing of God apart from any of the works of God. And I think you could raise some of the real problems that you're raising about that. Not to mention it's problematic metaphysically. You can't experience or view what's eternal in a direct way. You always know it indirectly through the works of God. So on this view, all the works of creation and providence are set aside, and you're supposed to just perceive God directly the way Dante wanted to do with Beatrice. As opposed to the what I'm suggesting, I'll call it the model of the Psalms, because I think it comes out in the Psalms, is that we know God through the works of God. And we're to reflect on the works of God. These are the works of creation, but also the works of providence. And so to love God doesn't mean you're giving God gifts because he's lonely or bored, but that you're seeing what God does and you're seeing that it's excellent. So it's to love excellence in that sense. So that's a kind of Aristotelian connection, but it's more than that in the Psalms, because it's not impersonal excellence, but you're loving God the Creator and God the Redeemer.
So here is where we can sort of join. Where am I coming from when I am contrasting the personal God with the transcendent God conception? So I put my cards on the table. For me, the transcendent conception of God is essentially basically the divine virtues: the good, the truth, and the beautiful. That's it. And so for me, to say that I'm devoted to God is to say that I'm devoted to these virtues, and that I'm going to lead a life with a commitment to try to promote or act in accordance with those virtues the best I can. And if I can't, I try to improve myself. So, and to me, the virtues of the good, the truth, the good, and the beautiful are not in time. So it is in that sense. So now I can sort of explain what do I mean, let's say, what does someone mean when they say they love God?
Yeah.
Well, they love to live a life which is committed to these virtues. And
I think that's fine so far. I mean, I don't have an objection to that, except for to say how that looks, because that is often, when I hear it, spelled out just in terms of that second commandment. So I'm committed to the good, the true, and the beautiful to my neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
And it completely overlooks the first commandment of what would that look like towards God. So, for example, does it involve acknowledging that there is an eternal being?
Mm-hmm.
Or could you go about your whole life and never have done that?
Yeah, and I am proposing here at least some not very deep understanding of Maimonides' project. Maimonides' project is that ultimately he genuinely believed that God is just these virtues. God is not quantitative, that's what it means to say God is qualitative. Yeah. It's identical to these virtues. And these virtues manifest themselves in the world, so to be devoted to God, for example, to love God is to be committed to a life that pursues these virtues. This is not to say that all I do is, I'm committed to the good, for example, so I'm going to just do good to my neighbor. Because any instance of doing good does not consume the commitment to the virtue of good. And this enables also to allow for the more psychological perspective, because a commitment like that requires an emotional investment. So that's my picture.
Yeah. So I think what it would make us do, though, is it gets us into metaphysics this way. Can properties or qualities like the ones you mentioned exist but not in a being? So what I mean by that is this, that the standard definition of God in theism is God as a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchanging in goodness, power, and knowledge. Mm-hmm. So this has three parts of the definition. It has the properties, say goodness, power, and knowledge, and it has what are called the incommunicable attributes. Only God is infinite, eternal, unchanging. Humans are finite, temporal, and changing, the opposite of those. So humans can have power, knowledge, and goodness, but only in a finite way, whereas God has them infinitely. And then the first part of the definition was the substance or being of God, that God is a spirit, which is to distinguish God from material. God's not a material object. Mm-hmm. God's an eternal spirit, which involves, that's how God can have knowledge. So God couldn't have knowledge if God was Jupiter, like the planet Jupiter, right? Planets don't have knowledge.
Right.
So I would wonder could the property of goodness exist apart from a being that is a spirit? So I don't think so. I think it's a property of being, not a being itself, and that it can't be a property of matter. So the very fact that we want there to be goodness could be turned into a kind of argument for how we know there's a good spirit, eternally good spirit, because you have to have that for goodness to exist.
This is a very difficult question, but here's how I would respond. What difference would it make if we compare the following two pictures? One picture is there is a being that is a spirit, and that being is a spirit has these properties, divine virtues, and it's the source of these. The other picture is there is no being that is a spirit. There are just these properties and these divine virtues, And these divine virtues are the source of all of the good, the truth, and the beautiful. In other words, what I'm asking is metaphysically and in terms of a religious life, what difference does the being that is a spirit make to what our commitments are?
I think it would bring us back to the question from last time of what's eternal. What would it mean, for example, to say goodness is eternal, but there isn't a creator? I would guess it slips into something like one of the systems, and Greek humanism is one of these systems, where all things are eternal. Not each individual thing. Each individual thing might come in and out of existence, but the system itself has existed without a beginning and is not personal. So that's Greek humanism. The origins of our philosophy, right, are Greek humanistic in that sense. And so it's in contrast to the model I've been using, biblical Judaism, which would say not all things are eternal, only God is eternal. And to make that claim, all things are eternal, is an example of idolatry, the very thing we began today about. You're attributing the eternal power of God to something which God actually created. It didn't always exist. So I think what matters, when you say, why does it matter, which of these two matters, that's the very most important thing that does matter. That's what divides those two systems, is precisely that question. Are all things eternal, or is there God the creator who particularly made the world in this way, intentionally, with perfect wisdom, wanted things like this to reveal something about his nature? That's God's self-disclosure.
Okay, I grant that. There could be a significant metaphysical difference between these two pictures. But now, let's ask for a moment, what difference would it make in the moral sphere, for example, or in the sphere of truth, or in the sphere of beauty? Couldn't somebody who believes in this metaphysical picture, where there is a spiritual being that is the source of the good and the true and the beautiful, and is a creator of everything, to the question, for example, how we should pursue beauty? Why there's beauty in flowers, or in rocks, a certain arrangement in rocks, or a shadow on the wall in a certain way. And now look at the other picture, which says, no, I don't know about this being that is spiritual. I know that the world manifests in many different ways, the good, the beautiful, and the truth. And I'm going to pursue it, and I'm going to appreciate this because it comes from a source that is not finite, that is not changing. Each instance of them manifests something eternal. In terms of appreciating these things, recognizing them, and even marveling them, and even being devoted to them, it won't make the difference. Unless you want something more from the one with the spiritual being than that.
I think the way you've described it so far probably hasn't captured those differences I described. So the way you said, for example, what is eternal expresses itself in an instance of beauty. So I use this phrase, the self-disclosure of God, to contrast it earlier with the beatific vision, that we don't ever know God directly. We only know God as God reveals himself to us in creation and providence. And so the way you just described these two, we haven't yet got to, I don't think, a clear distinction between them. But if someone was to say, if it's something like this, can't I ignore the reality of God who's revealing himself in these things and just look at those things? It'd be like saying, can't I just be occupied with the present and not the present giver? What's the difference? I enjoy the Nintendo either way.
I tell you what's the difference. There is a big difference, because each instant of focusing on something beautiful or something good or something true, if you only focus on that, then you're not devoted to any one of these things, because then next time you wouldn't care. So the thing for me is the devotion to these characteristics as they manifest themselves throughout the whole world, the universe, everywhere. And now the question is, in that commitment and devotion and aligning yourself more and more to appreciate these things as they manifest themselves, I want to know, why do we need to add the spiritual being? That's my question.
Yeah, well, so I think that's getting back to the first division I was mentioning. So what you're saying is, can't we have a system that says all things are eternal, there is no creation, and again, remembering when I say all things are eternal, I don't mean each individual thing, right? The Greek humanist system might admit that, of course, we come in and out of existence, but the stuff of the universe has always been there. There is no creation, and sometimes it comes about to be beautiful things, and there are true things about it and good things, but we don't need a creator. So I think what you're asking precisely is that, and I'm bringing it back to this question: if we're pursuing truth, then we'd want to know, is it true that all things are eternal or only some things are eternal?
What I'm trying to say is, let's suppose we grant what we talked about last time, and what you want is that there is a beginning. And let's suppose there was some being, something that kicked it all off. Okay, fine, great. But I still appreciate that being, not because the creation, but because of the characteristics of the creation, of the truth, the beautiful and the good. So I'm still have to be committed to the manifestation of these characteristics rather than the fact who created them. Why should I care about why should I be committed to that which created it rather than to these manifestation of these characteristics, which I would assume, if there were such a creator, that creator did it in this way so that we can grow through the appreciation of them and instances of them and immersing ourselves in them.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm understanding you, I think that's right. In other words, we have these two possible mistakes that come about. One is this otherworldliness I mentioned earlier, the beatific vision, which says nothing in this world matters. What matters is dying and having a beatific vision.
Right.
On the other hand, you'll have Greek humanism, which will say only this world matters.
Right.
I probably don't even exist later, so I got to make sure I maximize this now. And so I think what you're saying is the view I was trying to articulate as well, which is that the creation is a revelation of who God is.
And to me, it's the revelation of the truth, the beautiful, and the good in the whole universe.
Could be, yeah, those are fine.
And let me just say,
I have some questions about beauty in this sense, that I think there are a lot of commitments we have which shape how we understand beauty, such that getting your worldview right is required to understand what's actually beautiful. So truth, beauty, and goodness, there may be a kind of an order between them. So just a caveat about those, as opposed to everyone agrees on the same thing about beauty.
Yeah.
But I think, how about this? I think here's an issue that might help get to why it matters, is that you said, I'm going to strive to do this, and maybe I haven't always done that, I'll try to become better at doing it. And I think that's what the problem comes up. I haven't always been, and even now am not really committed to those things. At my best, I might want to be, but most of the time I'm not, and I certainly haven't been in the past. And so this raises the question of redemption. What is to become of that? Does it matter that I haven't cared about those things? I haven't sought the truth, and I haven't really cared about it. I've cared about lesser things that are idols. And does that matter? And is it something where I just need a self-help novel, and you'll hand me the best self-help novel out there, and I'll say, oh, I need to care about truth. I didn't know that. I'll start doing it now. Or is something else has to be done for me by God to achieve redemption?
Yeah, okay.
And so this brings us to this question of love. How about we use this word friendship? Because it's said of a specific person that he was the friend of God. And I think the reason why helps illuminate some of what we're talking about with love, and also helps out with today. Not just our discussion, but what today is. Because it was said of Abraham that he was the friend of God, and that could be taken in an anthropomorphic way, that he and God liked baseball and did things like that. But it comes specifically after Abraham is told to offer Isaac. And he goes through this process of offering his son as a sacrifice, and it stopped at the end of it. And after that, he's said to be the friend of God. And I take that to mean specifically that he came to a greater understanding than others had of what God would do to achieve redemption. And because of that greater understanding in a personal way. It's one thing to read about someone doing it. It's another thing to have to go through that yourself. That is a kind of love, friendship is a kind of love, that Abraham has, and the rest of us can read about and learn about. What will God do? So I think the question that remains for me, because I think I agree with what you were saying, but we still have to deal with our need for redemption. And today especially is an interesting solution to the problem of otherness and immanence, precisely because it's about that same thing Abraham did, right, of offering your son. And so here we have, in this event on Good Friday, both God as transcendent, because Jesus said to the Pharisees when they asked, "Who are you?" He said, "Before Abraham was, I am." So he's taking that name that God gave to Moses. So there's the I am, the eternal. And then we have the humanity of Christ also dying. And so we may not go into some of the details of that given time, but at least the fact that we're talking about this on Good Friday stands out to me as an example of we also have the problem not just being committed to the good, the true, and the beautiful, but that we haven't been and we need redemption. And what will God do about it?
Well, redemption. And what is that? Maybe we should open up for discussion, for questions.
Yeah, we probably should.
Because it's like already
For
2:07. I know that you have to go by 2:30 or so.
Roughly, yeah. So the personhood
we
of
started
God, Good
redemption.
Friday, and what is redemption?
Yeah. And the question about the afterlife and the redemption.
Yeah.
And
Well, if we're committed to the good, and if it turns out that I haven't actually been seeking, I like to say I have been, but when I'm honest, I haven't been seeking, and I should have been.
yeah.
What is the relationship of God to that problem?
Right.
No one seeks, no one understands, no one does what is right.
Okay.
Any questions?
Let's do it.
Now, these could be just general questions or for either one of us. Like, why was this so interesting? How often can we do these events? Those are good questions to start with. Yeah.
I guess my question would be, based on the final statements, is like, where does moral responsibility come from? Like, can we have moral responsibility without a personal God?
Yeah, Peter will give a good one for this.
Yes.
End of answer, yes.
Here is my take on your question. Can there be even morality at all without a personal God? I think that's your question, right? In other words, can there be good or bad moral categories in the absence of a God? And I'm assuming you're meaning a personal God, right? Okay. So to answer it very briefly, I believe that an old argument, which is controversial, Euthyphro dilemma, shows that even if you assume a personal God, you still haven't solved the problem of the objectivity of good and evil. At least that is the argument. Of course, there's a long debate, and I don't want to go into it. So, in other words, Euthyphro dilemma, if it's correct, shows that morality is autonomous from any personal being.
And part of the question I might have, do we need God for morality, is a very standard argument in classical apologetics. Raskolnikov says that if there is no God, all things are permissible in crime and punishment.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem is, I think what Peter's getting at is you have to take the time to define God, which Euthyphro dilemma doesn't do. It's a background of Greek polytheism. What is God? What is morality? And I especially think morality is connected up to the idea of good. What is good? So maybe what I would anticipate Peter saying is you could have morality because morality is aimed at what is good, and we can define what is good apart from God. I would add in that the highest good is knowing God. So there's a real big problem for morality if there is no God that you can know. And then secondly, with morality, another problem which we haven't really taught to at all about is this. If when you're dead, I'm not sure how you could ultimately justify morality. You could justify personal systems and preferences, but I'm not sure how you could justify an actual moral system and obligation to it. Right? You could give lots of systems like this. You could say, if we tax people like this, we can pay for education like that. And that could be true, objectively speaking. But you aren't going to be able to, without personal mortality, get to an explanation of why should I care and be committed to that. So I'm adding to your question this way. I'm saying not only do we need to raise a question about God, but we need to raise a question about my own commitment to any moral system you have. Why should I care if when I'm dead, I'm dead?
And my problem with that picture is, why should you care about right or wrong if there is a God? Is it because you get punished? If that's the answer, or rewarded, that's what I call, the goodies and the baddies, then morality becomes again a self-serving thing. I'm going to do something good because God will then reward me. And I don't consider that moral. I consider that more like a sort of like a egoistic. So
yeah, I think so. And I think that a lot of what I would call popular religion turns into precisely that, which is why I relate to, sympathize with the three figures I mentioned earlier, Feuerbach, Marx, and Freud. Because what they're objecting to, what they're interacting with mostly is that popular religion. And it raises the question then, if you feel that you're not part of popular religion, why is that the one that's mostly presented? And they're objecting to and showing the shortcomings of that religion is precisely this kind of egoist. Like, if I tell God I love him, he gives me a mansion, right? So I better tell him I love him and I'll get some nice stuff. That's pretty easy way to get a nice house.
Easily believe in God if I get a Lamborghini.
Yeah, and gold streets. Yeah. I do wonder about inflation in heaven. If pavement is gold, what standard is their monetary unit on? If you can just go out and there's gold in the streets everywhere, inflation must be awful. But that's a side problem we could deal with later. But yeah, I think that's part of it. If religion just turns into an opiate of the masses, right? Say these magic words, and when you're dead, you get a really nice thing. And then if you justify some morality, like here's some rules to follow so you get a really nice thing, I think Peter would be right in pointing out that seems self-serving. At least the humanist could say this: I think when I'm dead, I'm dead. I don't derive any benefit from it, but I'm a nice guy anyway. That seems better than my neighbor who says he's going to be a nice guy because he gets to go to heaven. And I'm personally think they're both wrong, right? But it would be right when Peter objects to this. This is the common view of morality, religious morality.
And just one more note, because I think there's another question there. I just want to say that in Judaism, for example, the focus is not on afterlife. That's up to God, who cares? The focus is, the mission is to sanctify the physical world. And the sanctification process is by applying the commandments. And that's why there's so much detail and so forth of how do you do it exactly in this inch here and that inch there, because you're dealing with physical stuff, and it matters how you deal with it. Because the doing it is not just merely, sort of robotically following rules. You're supposed to think that you are sanctifying the physical world by these actions, by following these commandments.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see how there's a kind of, Maimonides is a good example of Jewish thought, which does tend to focus on this world, and is this worldly. And then there's a kind of Greek thought, which is especially otherworldly, ignores this world altogether, and that's what I think that's where we get the beatific vision. Ultimately, is from Plato. Not from Scripture. I'm suggesting, I call it the Christian model, one that involves both of these, right? That the creation is a revelation of the eternal. So the sanctifying of the world involves that process of coming to know I am in the world. But it also, it's not simply a coming to know theology, because from the very beginning, you have this problem of sin and redemption, right? So it's not merely a kind of a theology class where we get to learn some new things, but applying it to ourselves in the fact that I need the Day of Atonement, or I need Good Friday, right? Not merely a theology class. So, but yeah, let's get...
You really want me to talk about sin again?
We got next time, because
we can now. Yeah.
Number 3.
Kind of coming on the tails of this question and the response that was given from both parties. Is it Dr. Lupu?
Peter.
Peter, okay. If we're suggesting that answering the ethical question of what is good can be accomplished autonomously, do you find a problem with it leading to subjective interpretations of what is good or evil, or a relativistic form of ethics? And if so, how would you, who or what determines what is good for a large population of people as opposed to what's good for the individual? And then for Owen, the question of good and evil, what is that understood relative to if you're going to have an objective standard?
This is related, I guess, right?
Yeah.
What's the standard for good or evil? So go ahead.
You want me to go first?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I distinguish 3 different categories: doing what I want, free will, and autonomy. Doing what I want should never be equated with either the other 2. And of course, in my classes, anytime I ask what is free will, everybody says doing what I want, and that leads to subjectivism. Autonomy is, by its very meaning, self-governance. And that means that the self-governance and all governance is enacting laws, which means that self-governance is enacting the laws by which I will conduct myself. So now the question arises, what are those laws? Are we creating them? Are we discovering them? If we're discovering them, where are we discovering them, and so forth? Law is central in all the stuff we talked about. We didn't use the word law yet, but it is absolutely central. You have the word. The word is really stands not for a word, it stands for the role of law. So in all of these discussions, we didn't talk about law, but so autonomy is constructing the laws by which I will conduct myself, and that puts constraints on whether I'm going to just do what I want, and therefore subjectivism or relativism. Now, Owen will ask, of course, suppose you think you got these laws, how do you know they're true? How do you know that they have any moral weight, merit? And he's going to tell you how.
That's good. Yeah, I think that's right. It's interesting. We haven't taught about laws. So laws, I would take a moral law to be a description of what you have to choose to get what is good. So defining law comes after defining what is good. You can't define law first because you need to know what is good, right? What do I have to do to get what is good? Well, it depends what is good. So a lot of times loving your neighbor or loving what is good turns into something more like human flourishing. So what sort of social construct do I need to have police, education, fire, to have a flourishing human life, right? How many hospitals, how many elementary schools, how do we pay for these things? We can call those goods. They're important parts of life. But when we're asking about morality, we're especially asking about what's the highest good, right? The reason for which I do all the other things. And so I think to get to what's the basis of law, we'd have to take the time to do that. Now, I said earlier, I didn't offer a proof for this, but I said earlier that knowing God through the works of creation and providence is the highest good. So morality is made objective that way. If I think you'd have a problem on a system that is purely materialistic, defining morality or defining laws. But given the way that Peter defined it, because I define it a little differently, autonomy and doing what I want. Mm-hmm. I take doing what I want to be the more neutral one. Where I think you're flipping them, where autonomy is the more neutral one. So, but either way, as long as once we figure out what each one of us means, it is interesting. Have you ever heard this before? Do what thou wilt is the whole of the law.
Do what?
Do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. Or Journey puts it this way, any way you want it, that's the way you need it. They're paraphrasing the first one, which is the summary of the law by Aleister Crowley, or in the Satanic Bible. You know Aleister Crowley?
No.
Oh.
I don't go into that stuff.
Oh, I don't either. I just listen to the Beatles, and he's on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. So,
You see, let me just say one more word about that, and maybe some other people have questions. I just want to point out, number one, Owen mentioned before sin. And that, in my mind, goes back to the concept of original sin.
it doesn't have to.
It doesn't have to.
I know where you're going, though.
Yeah, but I don't know. I don't want to go there. I'm just saying that I have a very different interpretation of the story of Adam and Eve. I also have a very different interpretation than normally of the story of the Imago Dei, namely in our image and likeness. But the most important thing is that in Genesis, in the creation, the actual creation story is not creating out of nothing. Is if you read it, there is already matter in chaos. It's creating the laws that organize matter that is in chaos. So the Old Testament Genesis story does not tell us anything about creating something out of nothing. It's creating law, order out of chaos. That's why so important to associate with, in Genesis, with God, the notion of law, logos, word. All of these things are the same sort of idea. And so, in my view, that thing, together with the story of Adam and Eve, tells us exactly what is the mission of humanity from the Old Testament point of view.
Now, I think we could probably put a asterisk by that to say maybe that's what we talk about next time, redemptive revelation, because I would read Genesis differently, affirming creation ex nihilo in the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I take that to be a phrase for the stuff. He created all things from nothing. And then description after that, though, that's when you get to the next verses, and the world was without form and void, and the Spirit hovered over the waters. And then you get into description of order, what we call subsequent creation, forming and filling what had originally been. And I think that's, for me, a very important point for the Jewish scriptures, precisely because they stand out in contrast to their neighbors who say what you said, which is at the beginning there was chaos. It's usually typified by water. The Egyptians thought this. And out of that comes some kind of order. And I read this as saying that even that first stuff was made by God. All things were given
which is fine. For now, I'm not going to quibble with that. We can quibble about the question of what does it mean for God to create something like that.
And that's where we end.
But what I'm insisting on is that the most important aspect of that first part is that God creates the laws that organize chaos.
Yeah, it's an interesting focus on, so the laws are there, certainly. I'm just suggesting the second step, which is why the word is used then in John 1, which is that there are those laws, and those laws reveal something about God. Yeah. That's what a word does. A word communicates. And so even in Genesis 1 it says, and then God said, let there be, right? There's a word there. Right. So just that next step of saying, not only is there this creation, the creation says something, it's a word, there's the word that communicates who God is.
And so, to me, the important thing is the first, that God is a lawmaker. And the law is very central. Because to me then, the question of creating an image and likeness, which is the big question of what does it mean, image and likeness? And I claim image and likeness means law creator.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that's part of it. Or having what it says in Genesis 1 is having dominion over the world. Yeah. And the animals are brought to Adam, and none of them are able to do that. So he needs a helper to be able to also have dominion.
But law in a law-like way, not just any dominion. You can have dominion without law.
Well, yeah,
you
so at the same time,
you can rule without law. You can rule just by whim.
Exactly. So it has to be cognitive. It's especially using your understanding.
Right.
So I think on those things are similar. What we're going to do for the next one, we'll probably have this question then about, let's say we do have the laws. There might even be a whole number of them, like 9 or 11, 10, let's say there's 10 laws, 10 rules.
Okay.
That still leaves open the problem of what if I didn't keep them? What if I've been a whitewashed tomb? What must be done for there to be atonement? And what is taught then on the Day of Atonement? What is taught in Abraham? What is done on Good Friday? So all these things come up then, because I don't think we disagree about those laws, and Peter and I haven't talked about it. We might not disagree about redemption either. We haven't talked about that. That's part of why it's fun, is you're seeing a living, breathing discussion. But wouldn't you like to know about redemption? How to be redeemed? Isn't Good Friday a good day to raise that question? Now, we don't have time to finish that up. We can have more questions, but I don't want to leave you and make you think, oh, it didn't get answered, because I hope it's something you think about. Maybe like between now and Sunday.
Yeah, we'll resume
How
the
about
next
that?
time.
Richard, you have a
Richard.
Yeah, I was going to follow up with Peter, because it seems like you slip into intentionality. You know, if the understanding is almost like a Platonic goodness, just take that virtue. It's acausal, causally inert, can't do anything. There's no intentionality. And so you may be able to explain moral value flowing from it in some way. There's some issues there of how evolving beings sort of connect then with this transcendent reality. But I think the issue of moral obligation is like, why am I obligated to that which is impersonal? And then the other issue is moral accountability. So we've got three things: moral value, obligation, and accountability. And those last two seem to be where your view runs into some problems. And yet I think you even slip into it, because you say, well, there's a lawmaker. Well, you're slipping in intentionality, and you're sort of moving away from it. I don't know if that's just a metaphor for you or a linguistic device.
Well, what's interesting too is, because you mentioned the kind of Platonic form, and Peter's saying, hey, this is kind of like Maimonides. So before we say, well, Peter is getting the Old Testament right, well, Peter's thinking about the Old Testament probably in line of Maimonides, who's doing it in line of Plato, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so earlier when I said, oh yeah, that's Greek otherworldliness, and you say, yeah, those Greeks do that. But I'm wondering, you might end up with a kind of Platonism anyway, right?
Well, Richard, let me just clarify your question. Are you asking the following? According to me, there is the form of the good, right? And I'm supposed to be committed to doing the good and all that according to the scriptures. The question that, if I understand you correctly, why should the form of the good compel me to do anything? Is that your question?
That's part of it, and then that's the second part, the obligation part. Why is there an obligation laid upon me? But also then the accountability.
So even if I recognize that there's a form of the good, why should I have any obligation to do anything? Mm-hmm. So this is a very good question, because it is kind of puts enormous pressure on any Platonist view, because according to Platonism, the forms are causally inert. They don't have causal power. So why should even recognize the form of the good compel me to do anything? And that's a good question. I have to make up a long story.
Let me see if this helps though. Because I think in one sense, and maybe this is more Aristotelian, but I'll lump them together. In one sense, the good, we might think of obligation as the kind of religion you mentioned earlier, where I'm obligated by the whip. So I'm whipped forward to be good,
Mm-hmm.
right? But in another view, I'm drawn towards the good by its very nature.
Mm-hmm.
When I understand what is good, that draws me toward it. That's how it works in Aristotle. So I'm not whipped towards the good, I'm drawn to the good by the very nature of the thing. And so I suppose someone from this sort of the Greek dualist worldview might just say, that's what the definition means. I mean, once we say good, that's what it means, is the thing I want, the thing that will bring about eudaimonia. And so someone might say that. Now that doesn't get to the obligations you're asking about, and I think intentionality is an important thing that we didn't really talk about, but it's important for the idea of a spirit. God creates intentionally, not just flowing from the being of God, which is more like pantheism. So we want to capture this idea that God creates intentionally and with the purpose of revealing himself, of who God is. And so that's one topic we didn't get to today, but I think that's important, that creation reveals God necessarily, but also intentionally by God. And that's part of what it is to be a person, right? And so earlier when I was wondering if you're slipping into saying all things are eternal, you could easily slip, if you're using a Platonic model, into some kind of emanation theory of creation, where the creation just comes about because God is so good, God's goodness overflows. And I wonder if there's some about that in Maimonides even. But the goodness of God just overflows into creation, which is not the same as theism. It's much more like pantheism, Greek pantheism. And it's contrasted with the idea that God didn't have to create, but God did intentionally create for these purposes.
Yeah.
Good, other questions? Don't be afraid, yeah.
Along similar lines, but this is more of a metaphysical question. In the discussion, you're assuming that humans have personhood, and then we're talking about the eternal being, and I'm wondering if the eternal being or the source of being is impersonal, how we explain personhood in humans, and how would you go about solving that gap?
Yeah, I think that's a good question about the analogy. To put it this way, did he who makes the eye, does he not see? Or he who made the ear does not hear? So the reality of our own moral concerns or our own ability to see is analogous the other way. Of course then, the one who created them knows those things, right? If you created something with infinite deliberate wisdom, you know all about it. So I would think that that's the case both for personhood and for other qualities like good and evil. And I think that's a common argument against a materialist cosmology, is that you can't ultimately have persons then. As what Hume said about persons is, there aren't any. When I look inside, all I see are a bundle of mental images. There's no soul or person. I would think that would be a significant problem if you're going to take a materialist approach to the world. The person's an illusion.
There is no self,
Yeah.
according to Hume. You can't find self in introspection.
Yeah,
Of course, there's
desire.
a very good reason for that, is because the self is the thing that is doing the introspection.
Yeah, right. That's what you ask Hume is,
All you
who's
did is-
doing the looking,
Yeah.
right?
You elevated the self into the introspector, and now you're looking only at contents of,
Yeah, you
of
say,
the conscious
when
stream.
I look inside, all
Yeah.
I see are mental images.
If you take him serious and you say there is no self, his conclusion, then there is no introspector either. And so the whole thing is kind of like fades away.
You mentioned materialism, Owen. Is it the same if we think about ideas? So say it's not a materialist view, but we think there maybe is an immaterial substance, but it's ultimately personal. How can we explain
Yeah.
persons?
I think that's right. I think the idea of ideas can't exist apart from a mind or spirit, right? So if we wanted, the Platonists have a big problem, I think, with that, with saying there's the idea of goodness or the idea of beauty or the idea of truth, apart from there being an eternal mind. I use the word spirit in the definition of God, but by that I mean mind, conscious. So I think you would have a problem in getting to those properties. I indicated that earlier when I said, once we raise these properties, it gets us into the metaphysical question about being, substance. And so those are things that the substance called spirit has, right? So in philosophy, the two substances are mind and matter, and define them by saying, what is mind? No matter. What is matter? Never mind. Right? These are distinct, right? Mind is not material, but it doesn't take up space. You can't get a jar of mind and hand it off, but it's conscious. And on the other hand, matter takes up space and is not conscious. And so reductionist theories tend to be one or the other, right? So the reductionists that we're more familiar with in the West are materialists who say everything can be accounted for just by things that take up space, including the mind. But there are also idealist reductionists who say everything can be accounted for just in terms of minds, no matter. And so we could look and see, can we reduce all of them to one, or does the reality of both persist? There is mind and there is matter, and ultimately God is a being, not simply ideas or forms. So you could probably construct a pretty good argument the way you're suggesting. Now, we'll be pausing. I think we'll both be around to answer more questions if you have one-on-one ones. However, keep aware that we'll have more of these. It's always good. I think these are successful.
Yeah.
And you saw some philosophical discussions. And again, this is Philosophy Out West discussion series here that I put on each semester. So look for more of these in the fall. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.